to start the surprising collection of historic Malta maps at Palazzo Falson, I would like to start by saying that sometimes people come to my house and they see the maps on my walls and they tell me, I don't have maps like you, you know. And in fact, I don't have any maps at all. And then I tell them, do you have the Virtual? Oh, yes, I have that. Why, you already have 2 maps, Malta maps there. Do you have the Bella? Oh, yes. I have another 2 maps. So really, maps should not be on the walls. Maps should be in books. And most of the maps which we are going to see here are in books, as they should be. There are maps which were never meant to be in books, and these are broadsheets. But usually they are 16th century maps, Italian maps. Last Saturday, Dr. Ganado was mentioning his collection of Italian 16th century maps, what are called the Ferrari Maps. They always came out as a single sheet, and and they used to bind them in volumes, which were the precursors of the atlas. So much so that sometimes, when the map is smaller than the rest, they used to add a border to bring up the height, so that when they form the atlas, or rather a collection of maps together, they would have the same size. So really, maps should be in books, not on walls. And what we have on the walls are unfortunately books which have been broken by dealers, and once they are broken, I'm sorry to say, we have lost sometimes their origin. And in fact, one of our jobs is cartobibliography. We put the map back inside the book when we discover from which book it has come up. I'm going to go chronologically, okay? I'm going to go on chronologically. And I start with the Perez d'Aleccio prints. Now, the Perez d'Aleccio prints were first, as you know, were painted, the siege scenes were painted on the wall, which is in Valletta at the Grand Salon, in the Grand Salon. And it was later that he did the set of engravings, 15 engravings, showing the siege scenes which we know of. However, the album of Perez d'Aleccio is very rare. And in fact, we only know about 8 albums in the whole world which are complete. Then you find your odd single sheet here and there. So very few copies were printed of this album. And I'm going to take one example of these scenes, and this is a scene which describes the whole war which happened during the siege. In fact, when it was done into a print, it was called the Tutta la Guerra. So it was the whole scene. Why am I showing this? Because this is usually the one which is chosen when somebody wants to describe the Great Siege. It's a very particular, because you got all the action all together. And this is in fact folio 11. Now, when one day I got an email from a chap from Peru, he told me that he has a copper plate of a Perez d'Aleccio siege map. And it was exactly this, the Tutta la Guerra. And this is a print pulled from that copper plate. The copper plate is in my collection, And it took me 9 years to manage to get hold of it. In fact, his surname was Ferrari. They were a French family. They had gone to Peru, and it was given to him by his grandfather as a graduation gift. And he wanted to sell it, and he wanted it to come back to Malta. And I was lucky enough to buy it from him. Incidentally, I recently had a phone call from a certain Joachim Pinto Ferran telling me that he is the nephew of this Ferran who sold me the copper plate. And I heard from his voice that he was quite near. And I heard that he was quite near. And I told him, "Are you in Malta?" "Yes." He told me, "I live in Zabar." So you see how small this world is. And I told him, "Then you have to come and see it." And he came to see it, and he was quite pleased with this. And when I received the copper plate, I noticed that on the top right corner there was this monogram NB, which stood for Natalia Bonifacio. And from this copper plate, we discovered that the prints were not engraved by Perez d'Aleccio. They were engraved by Natalia Bonifacio. Perez d'Aleccio did the drawings of them, like he painted the frescoes in the palace, but he was not the one. It was always thought that he was the one who painted them. But in reality, it was Natalia Bonifacio. Since the plates of Perez d'Aleccio were not available, and there were very few prints made from these, then another person took over and did the prints of them. He redid them completely. And the first edition, as you can see, it's not even the same title, because this is Disegni della Guerra, and before we said I veri ritratti, you see, by Lucini. He reprinted them again. They were so popular that he actually made three reprints were done of them. The first one was published in Rome by Niccolò Allegri in 1631, and then followed by 2 other editions published in Bologna by Negroponte and De Rossi, sporting the same date, but they were probably different. The copy at Palazzo Falson is the one by De Rossi. Now, the book is supposed to be all together, but it has been dismantled, and they are in the corridor here. They are in frames, but they are together. Still, they have not been separated. They are still together. But this is what happens, and usually when you break up a book, if there is an inheritance, 4 go to one person, another 4 go to the other, and they get dispersed, which is an unfortunate thing. You can see that the Lucini album had 16 prints this time and not 15, because he added another print showing the Grandmasters. So you can distinguish between the Perez d'Aleccio print and the Lucini prints by having this added. Another thing which distinguishes the Lucini print, let me see if I can find it here. Is that he moved the writing at the bottom. Before, Perez d'Aleccio had writing inside the printed area. He removed that and he put the explanation underneath. That shows you that it's a Lucini print and not a Perez d'Aleccio print. If I go quickly back, you see there? The text is inside the area of the... So the ones you're going to see here outside have got that underneath. I'm lucky enough that another plate has cropped up in Peru, and I'm in the process of buying it. And this is another folio sesto. It has been cut, but fortunately they cut it from the center. So although I have missing, the bulk of the print is still there. And on the verso, sorry, yes, this is the one. It has been cut like that, you see. So I still have the gist. And on the back side, there is an oil painting after Barocci. I'm looking forward to receiving it. She was supposed to come in August, she didn't come with it. She was supposed to come in November, she didn't come with it. And she's supposed to come. The thing is, the first time when I paid for the first one, I didn't know the person except by email, and I sent him half the money in advance. So I was exposed for half with nothing in my hands. And then I received it, and I don't want to do the same thing with the second one, you know. There's too much money involved in it. So anyway, when it arrives, I will be telling you more about it. So I'm looking forward. That means we will be having two in Malta, two original copper plates of Perez d'Aleccio. Another book which you will be seeing later on, it's exposed there, is a book by Anton Francesco Cirni. Cirni was, he took part in the Spanish expeditions, and in the book he describes most of the wars which happened between the Turks and the Knights, including obviously the Great Siege. And in it, there is a map of Malta, a woodblock map of Malta, which is this. It's in very good condition. I have a copy of this one, of this book, and it's from the collection of the Stuarts, the Queen's family. And they say, how come you have, because the rest of the collection is in Windsor Castle. But there was this auction sale in 1850. They bought some of the books from their cousin, and they didn't buy the rest, so that's why. But I have the coat of arms of the Windsor, so it has quite a good provenance. It's a wood block, and it shows the end of the siege. You see, they are going their way. You see, you know, they are. So they are dispersing and leaving the country. Okay. A wood block is when I say wood block, the block is gauged is gauged out, and what stands up in relief is the one which you see printed. Okay. It's in very good condition, the one that they have here. And then a book is by Giacomo Bosio. There's a painting of him by El Greco. And in it, there's a plan of Valletta. It was published in 1602, the first one. And the coat of arms of Grand Master of the Wignacourt can be seen at the bottom left corner. At the bottom right corner is the inset map of Malta inside a decorative cartouche. And if you notice, that is the same map which we are using for our Malta Map Society logo there. So it's the same, except for one little thing. This is the one which was published, but later there is another one which has the monogram of Villamena, the person who did the map. Probably he did this, the Villamena one, to be able to sell some of the maps separately as broadsheets. This is at least what we think. And you don't find all that many. This one is in the Ganado collection, which is now at Musa, you know. Ganado has made a very big collection there. And you can see this is we actually copied this, because if you see it there, the monogram is still, you can see it on our. Another book which they have here is the Descrizione di Malta di Abela, the Commendatore Abela. Abela is not very easy to find. In fact, I know very few people who have the actual copy. And you have the copy? Yeah? Good. I don't have it, so... And it's very difficult to come by, actually. And I know very few people who have the book. It contains several engravings, including 3 maps. And they're all signed by Bonamici. So we can assume, although we can never be 100%, that the others were done by Bonamici, you know. This is the Map of Malta. Now this has no title really. What it has is a quote from the Book of Prophets. And it says, in insulis maris nomine domini Dei Israel. Chapter 54, written on a bandolo with cleft ends at the top center, above the shield of the order. There's a compass rose there, and the open compass above the scale bar. And there's a ship and a monster. Probably this was done by Bonamici. I should think so. Then there is also another plan of Mdina in the book, with the title Veteris Merite Urbis Typus, the image of the old city of Malta. And also a map of Poales of St. Paul's Bay. Tavolo della Cava del Poales o di San Paolo, ove si dimostra il luogo dove si ruppe la nave e fece naufragio l'Apostolo. Plan which shows the bay where St. Paul's the Apostle was shipwrecked. The area is now better known as St. Paul's Islands or Sermoon. Okay? So we have 3 maps in that book. Then Abela Chantar improved on the Abela book and added more detail in their Malta Illustrata. And again, in this book, we find maps. This was published in Malta, and probably it could be by Tar. Could never know. We don't know who the engraver was, but it could have been Sebastiano Tar. The map is very similar to the map found in the Saint-Prix, Malta par un voyageur français, published in 1791. And Musa has the copperplate of this map in his collection too, under copperplate. Unfortunately, it has been ruined. We tried to make pulls from it, but it didn't come out. I remember we wanted to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Heritage Malta by issuing some prints from this, but it wasn't. So they have another copperplate of Petrosky, the Map of Malta, and we published that instead. So we have. They also have the Saint-Prix copperplate by Tarukol. And this is, as you can see, is very similar to this map. It is being copied from that map and actually reduced. You know, it's a small thing. Yes. The entire map found in Malta, etc. The copper plate, as you can see, has been chrome plated. They chrome plate the copper plate so that you can make more pulls out of it. Obviously, they have ruined the copper plate, but you can now make as many pulls as you like from it. But that's why it looks sort of silver. I have one at home which has been plated, electroplated like this, and to be able to make. You ruin it, huh? These were done in the 60s, and probably to give as souvenirs or whatever. Again, in the Abela Chanta, we get the same thing. We have a map of Mdina, like the Abela one, and we also have a map of Palace of St. Paul's Bay, where St. Paul was shipwrecked. And underneath there are these fossils and this monster with the plate. Then there is Abbaye de Vertot. They have an Abbaye de Vertot here. Histoire de Malte. It came out for the first time in 1726 in 2 volumes in folio. In Flair Brincard's book on Tinier, we read, the opportunistic Abbaye de Vertot, the order's historian, sought René de Jacob de Tinier for his exemplary ability to create plans of fortifications which resulted in a series of plans of the harbor's fortification schemes. So it could be that the maps that we're going to see were done actually by Tinier. Robert Take issued a book, A Publishing History of a Prohibited Bestseller, where he lists all the editions. So it's a very good book. I have in my collection the Royal Folio, and only 50 copies were done, and it's in very good condition. I got it from America. And this is the map of Malta, which is found in Berthaud. The imprint says C.A. de Beret sculpts it, but the maps were drawn on site by René de Tinier. So René de Tinier would have done the drawing, and then the engraver would have been de Beret. Okay? Because it's not the first time, like we've said with Perez d'Aleccio. Perez d'Aleccio was the one who drew them, but then Natale Bonifacio was the one who engraved them. There's a second state of the map, and it is found in 2 Dutch editions with the de Beret removed. And you find only the maps inside those books, but no portraits. You know, the Vertot, you usually find also the portraits of the grandmasters. In these Dutch editions, there are the maps, but not the portraits. And in the maps, there are no de Berets there. It has been removed. So we'll know, if you see one without the de Beret, it means it has been taken out from a Dutch edition. There's also the plan of Valletta inside the book. And again, de Beret Filius, it could be that, that by which time his son had already been used, and he gave him this plan for exercise. And it's also dated 1724, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a second state, obviously, without the imprint, like we find in the Malta map, without the imprint in the Dutch editions always. Recently, when I say recently, only 3 weeks ago, a chap found the preparatory drawing of the Valletta map from abroad, and he got it. And as we said, it is by Tinier. And it is in bistre or brown ink, and it is so perfect it almost looks like printed. Now, how do we know whether this is a preparatory drawing or whether this was a drawing taken from the other? The reason is because you find some differences. For example, here the compass rose is like this, but then the printed compass rose is simplified. If I had to copy from the original, I would not elaborate. I would just copy what I've seen. Whilst here, in this case, the engraver decided that there was too much rubbish around that thing, and he simplified the. So when you find a preparatory drawing and it's not exactly the same as the original print, then the chances are that it was a preparatory drawing and not something copied from the print, okay? Again, this is something which, unfortunately, in Malta, we don't take any notice of. We are interested in Malta maps, and the rest can go. But in the Verto, there's also another map of the Eastern Mediterranean, showing the islands of roads, etc., executed by De Lille. And nobody even mentions this, but it's a map. This is another, in the same book, a plan of the harbour of roads. It's another map in the book. And yet nobody takes any notice of these. Another map inside the book of the Mediterranean, which shows where the knights were over the years until they finished up in Malta, showing the place where the order had been before arriving in Malta. And it's a nice map. And it has connections with Malta also, like Rhodes has connections with Malta. Here they have the ancient and modern Malta by Magellan, and it's a very large map, and it's slightly smaller than the De Palmeos map from where it is taken. In fact, it is 56 by 130 centimeters. In it, there's also a view of Malta. There, and then the cartouche is quite enough. Another edition of the Magellan came out in 1805 and in 1809. Okay. This is the De Palmeos map, which is not in the collection here. It's one of three maps, actually. There's the map of Malta, there's a map of Valletta, and there's a plan of Fort Chambray. They're very large maps. They came out as broadsheets. They were never meant to be inside books. They were meant to be displayed, and they are very beautiful ones, especially when you see one of them which has been colored contemporaneously. Beautiful indeed. Inside the Magellan, there's also a bird's eye view of the city of the port of Malta, and it has the numbers. There's the legend which explains what the numbers stand for. And then in the third edition, in 1809, there are some which came out with the full map. But then there are some editions which came out with only Gozo. And the reason is because the copper plate, which was quite big, must have been damaged, and so they cut Malta off and left Gozo. It's the only time when we let Gozo suppress Malta. We won't do it again. I don't know what do you think. I'll show it you. So when you find a book which has only the Gozo map in it, that's a bonus. Don't say because I have half of it missing, because this is quite rare. The people who have a copy of this book are lucky people, because they only have half the map. Okay, so and in fact, but it's a good when you're buying, it's good to always quarrel with the person who's selling it to you, because you say you're selling me half a map. So, but it's actually complete. But we shouldn't tell anyone about this. So. Another copy of there was a French translation of ancient Malta called Malta and Sicily Moderne, which was published in Paris in 1809, and they have this map, the same map, but in smaller size. Not very common, very difficult to find. I haven't managed to find a copy. I would love to have a copy of this. The second edition was published in Marseille and dated 1805, but wrongly written, because if the first one came out in 1809, the second one could not come out in 1805, so there is a mistake. And then a third edition came out in Paris in 1820. So there, when you see 1805, it's a mistake of the printer, the date. Because if the first one is 1809, the second one cannot be 1805. So be careful with these. Very difficult to find this map, especially with the book. Now here in the collection there is also the description of Malta and Gozo by Percy Badger. Now, 9 editions have come out of Badger, and from 1838 to 1881. But there were 11 printings, because in the first one there was a second printing, and in the third edition I think there was also another second printing. So there are 11 editions in total. In 1869 the title changed to Historical Guide to Malta and Gozo, improved and augmented by Nicola Zammit, which is a thicker volume. But most of the engravings in there, actually they are not engraved, lithographs in there are the same. In the first edition, one was printed on thin paper and the other on thicker paper. This one, the one which is in the collection, has been printed on thicker paper. And the map is this one. And you can see there's also an appearance or a view of Valletta. In fact, it says an appearance bearing southeast 13 or 14 miles. There's the north and the magnetic north showing there, and the cartouche. And these were done by Brockdorff. The person who did the maps was Brockdorff. Okay. This is a very, very rare book. It's called The Importance of Malta, concern, whatever. And this was printed in 18, let me see. I think in 1803 or 1804. And he is explaining why Malta is so important for the British. And this was in 1799, so they already had an eye on Malta. And he went on this trip from England via Cairo, and he was saying that how important the island would be for the British. And there is this map where he explains that it's right in the center of the Mediterranean. I've never seen this book anywhere. I've never seen this book anywhere. It's only I found it only here. So that makes the collection, you know, people sometimes ask me, what makes a collection? If I have the same type of maps that you have, then we have two similar collections. But once I have something which is out of the ordinary, then your collection suddenly has impact. It makes it important, even for one thing. I mean, I'm very proud of the fact that I own the original copper plate of Perez. I mean, it's impossible. It's a miracle, even for it to survive, because 16th century copper plates are rare in themselves. Of any subject, very few 16th century copper plates have survived. The reason is, once you don't use them, and copper was expensive, you just melt them. You don't. So it's very rare for a copper plate to survive, and such an early copper plate. So that already makes, in a way, my collection important. The rest might be the same like you have. Everybody has a home and at home. But if you then have something like that, So this is another, that makes it important. There's another book which they have here of Robert Montgomery Martin, History of the British Possessions in the Mediterranean, comprising Gibraltar, Malta, Gozo and the Ionian Islands, printed in 1837 in London. It has a very detailed description of Malta. He was Anglo-Irish, and I think he was a bit sympathetic towards the Maltese because they were Catholic, and he was Catholic, I think. He gives a very good description of Malta, and it touches on various subjects: agriculture, commerce, population, system of government, and even doctors' fees. So if a doctor comes to your house, you pay 6p. But if you have venereal disease, it's 5 shillings. Probably it's the mercury which he has to give you, that's all, which was, it wasn't cheap, I think. This is the map which is found in the Montgomery. It has an inset map of Valletta, and it was engraved by C. Walker. The book also has a map of the Ionian Islands. I couldn't print it, so I didn't want to ruin the book. I don't have a loose map, so this was loose, so I couldn't do it. Now this is the creme de la creme of the collection here. This is one of a portolan by Joseph Schirò. Now, in fact, not in the last edition of the journal that we published, but the one before, Dr. Ganado did an article on the different editions by Schirò. And in fact, at least 33 editions came out, you know, over the years. In fact, the first edition came out in 1764. There's even a pirated edition. I have it in my collection. I try to go for the unusual as much as possible. And which has no imprint, it doesn't say where it was printed, no date, nothing. This one, which is in here, is a copy which we haven't found in any library in the world. Otherwise, we would have included it in the Ganado. In fact, he's going to do another article now to increase, because since then 2 new editions have come out, and this is one of them. And as it happens, this is the map which is in it, and it is distinguished from the others because there is this 57 there, the depth of brasses of the, which is not found in the other. I had bought this map not very long ago with this 57, but we didn't know from where it came from which edition. And then when I started studying the collection, boop, this comes out. And whew, we've never seen it, So this, again, with this one thing, that's already enough to make the collection important. And there is Miege. It's quite a common book. And there is this plan of Valletta in it. It's in 4 volumes. There's also, because usually in these books you find the Valletta map and the Malta map together. Not always, but usually you find them both. So this is the map of the Malta at the end of volume 2, and the previous one was at the end of volume 1, you know. Now this is interesting. They have this copy of letters from Malta and Sicily by a young naturalist, George Waring. It's a small book, And then there's a map of Valletta, of Malta, sorry. Recently, I bought this book. It is the same book, but this time it has a different title, and it has a variant title which nobody knows about. And in fact, there are only two examples known. One Rhodes House Library, University of Oxford, and the International Islamic University in Malaysia. I found this in Australia, and I bought it. So it is definitely by Robert Harvey, because he was in business with his, and he succeeded him, and he succeeded him in 1846. So although there is no date, I'm assuming that it was published in 1846. It's the same as the other one, except the other one has as a frontispiece a Latin boat, which had nothing to do really with the book. In this edition, the Latin boat has been removed, but otherwise all the engravings are there. Again, it's even the previous one. It's not very common. You don't find it that often, but this is extremely rare. Then there is Porter. A lot of people know about Porter, and there are again various editions. And it has, in fact, 12 editions came out between 1858 and 1883. And in it you find this map of the harbour area and the positions of the enemy during the siege of Malta. But you see plan of the fortress of Malta at the time of the siege by the text of 1565. But there is another version, a history of the fortress of Malta, again by Porter, printed by Kumbo in 1858, where again it has a map, but the coloring is different. And it was done by Brogdorf. The other one was done in England. So Brogdorf copied it, and he inserted it in this edition, which is an abridged edition of the former one. The Gollcher library has the former one, okay? But I'm explaining to you what the different editions, so we know the... Then there's Pietro Paolo Castagna. There were 3 editions came out. There's the first edition 1865 on quite good paper. A second edition 1869 on newspaper almost. And the first edition came, I think even the other editions, they came out in fascicoli, okay? And I know of a book by Castagna, still in its original paper wrappers, still in their individual fascicles, you know how it came out, in fascicles, you know. And then there's the third edition, which came out in 1888 with an appendix 1890. The breakwater, and then there's a spare there, which was meant to be added, but it was never added. And in fact, if they want, as recently they have been saying that they want to, they want to have for boats or piers, whatever. If they don't put something like that, the boats will go up on the parvis of the church in front. Infatti minflok użaw dak l-isperu, but they used x'ismuh and they didn't do that anymore, you know. but it's very interesting. For example, Michael Cassar, when I showed it to him, he said, I've never seen it. I have never seen. So this was a proposal by the people, you see, there. By the Koeman partners who designed the breakwaters, and they were studying the Gregale, and that would have been the mitigation for the Gregale. Rimgerbe point. This was not done. This was mitigation measures, including wave-breaking blocks, were considered and implemented instead of it. I wonder what would have happened if they did it. Actually, they probably would have blocked a bit the entrance. But it's very interesting. It's because it's an original document. Okay. Now this is the Harrison and Hubbard report. Again, this was published in 1945, and in it there are various maps, including this for the rebuilding of Valletta after the war. And there is the Palace Square, and here there is a car park. Now that has a connection with my family. My uncle was the papas of the Greek church, and that is where the Greek church was. It was hit by a bomb, and it was flattened, and they wanted to do a car park instead. And what they did was they cleared, and my uncle was very cross. He said, because I'm in the middle of Valletta and they were going to take him, whatever. So he had a friend, Cardinal Tisserand, who was a very good friend of the governor. He wrote to him and he said, okay, build. And he built it there. And when I was telling this story to Mario Buhajar, he told me that Tisserand, the secretary of Tisserand, was the father of Alain Blondy. Now the final one is this sketch map of Zabar. I'm not going to talk about this map. All I'm going to say that it is connected with the Volunteer Defense Force or the Home Guard. And the reason is because Jan Beunderman is going to talk about it after I finish, and I don't want to spoil his fun and our fun. Okay? Thank you very much for your attention.
It's clear that in the run-up to the outbreak of the war, the authorities here in Malta were quite concerned and quite cognizant of the fact that if Italy were to join, and if it were to join on the wrong side, then Malta would be in for a hard time, which is of course precisely what happened. So they had formed a Malta volunteer force, an auxiliary volunteer force, which soon after June of 1940 was renamed to the Malta Home Guard. There are quite a number of people like Captain Gollcher who were interested already in the very early days about the state of the civil defense preparations. And so I have read all the diaries of Captain Gollcher, and when you start reading about 1940, you see him in the surroundings of Rabat, in the surroundings of Sijiri, mostly through personal contacts that he had in the military. But everything became much more formalized when on the 2nd of January 1941 he was called by Colonel Vella, who was then the officer in charge of the KOMR and subsequently the Malta Home Guard, and was asked to assume responsibility for the position in that particular sector, which he did. Obviously, there had been preparatory ideas, but to call them plans was probably overstating it. And so, in a very real sense, Captain Gollcher and his equivalents in other sectors had to start from the ground up. He was, as was everybody in his position, required to live in his zone, so he lived in Zabar. He found a place where he could live on number 113 Sanctuary Road. My wife and I were there last week, There is still a house 113 in Sanctuary Road. Whether it's the same house, I couldn't swear. I was just told that there has been a period that the numbers were renumbered. So I can't swear to that. But obviously his first task was to take stock of what he had there in the way of volunteers. There were quite a number of people who had come forward. The count that I have found is 119 people who owned a rifle and about another 13 who did not have officially a rifle. So his preliminary focus was to acquaint himself with the volunteers and to make them aware that by joining the Malta Home Guard, they were under military law. They were members of the British military forces. So a certain amount of discipline was required, a certain amount of training was required, they were required to show up, things that they didn't initially take to. So he found a parade ground, which is here on the map. He found a place where he could store the supplies, to the extent there were any, near the Homepesh Arch, and he had found himself his own house. And of course this is a process that repeated itself in Zaytoun and in Marsaskala. So when you read the diaries, you see him, he's constantly moving back and forth to stay on top of things. He basically had to create something out of nothing. So he needed to find rifles. And many of these people in Zabar had rifles because they were cacciatori, they were hunters, and so they had a rifle. Which is not to say that they had ammunition. Nor is it to say that they did with the rifle what Gollcher would have wanted him to do. So he needed ammunition, he needed helmets. Oddly enough, many of the helmets were Italian helmets. I think mostly picked up from retreating armies in North Africa. But you know, it's just to show how scarce the most basic things were. They needed uniforms, even though initially that was not officially required. But oddly enough, he writes at one stage in his diary that he had been able to get uniforms with the bottoms. I mean, I wonder what they were without the bottoms. But anyway, maybe that in itself was to scare off the enemy, I don't know. They needed to be trained in gas masks, they needed to be trained on night duty, they needed to be trained on what do you do with a parachutist, an enemy parachutist. And all these things which sound a bit like fun, in fact came in very handy, if not required, very early on, already in May, June of 41, when a British pilot, or an Allied pilot, came down in the sea just off Marsaskala in Gollcher's sector. His men from Marsaskala had to go out by boat and try and save the pilot, which they succeeded in doing. But conversely, shortly after that, his team in Zaytoun had to pull out because an Italian plane had come down. The pilot was in very bad shape but had survived. But by the time that Gollcher came, the men basically died. So, you know, these things were very, very pragmatic, very practical, and one could very quickly see the use for this. A lot of time was spent on the parade ground, partly to show off to the visiting superior officers, but partly simply to impose a discipline. It's clear that when you read the diaries, he followed the greater war scene very, very closely, understandably. And so he has lots of comments about the retreat of the Italian armies in Libya. He has lots of comments about the turnaround after Stalingrad of the Russian forces on the East Front. And you can sense that the mood in late 42, early 43 begins to change. And very clearly that is the period that has been the hardest, sort of, you know, mid 42, end 42. And so Gollcher spent a lot of his time on building morale. Whereas you can sense that later he spent a lot of time building discipline or maintaining discipline. But basically at the end of 42, mid 43, of course the invasion of Sicily, the advance of the armies in Italy, you can tell that the Malta Home Guard was beginning to be, I wouldn't say disassembled, but there was much less pressure. And so the Malta Home Guard was discharged, if you can call it that, in December of 44, and Captain Gollcher was decommissioned, if that's the word, at the end of February in 1945. So he'd spent 4 years. He was 52 when he entered, when he assumed the responsibility. He was not a youngster, and obviously he was 56 and a bit older. It'd been a rough time for him in a certain sense because he was required to live there, which meant that his wife, of course, lived on her own in this house. And when the house was bombed, as you know it was, in May of 43, she was here alone and he was there. And you know, these are trying times. Trying time in a very, very different level in the sense that he had, of course, not his own transport. He had his own vehicle, but obviously getting petrol, he was not a priority. And so he had to hitch a ride with the military lorries whenever he had home leave. And he had home leave about once a week at best, sometimes days, sometimes 48 hours. And I have come across many references in the diaries that he walked home, which doesn't leave you much time in your 24 hours. So that is the Zabar map, and I thought I'd leave it at that. Then I'd like to have a look at this, which Joseph already mentioned, and I have perhaps seen other things in there than he saw. One of the first things that struck me is that there is no Fortinier. And Fortinier was built in 1793, and this was issued in 1839. Why is there no Fortinier? And the answer is terribly simple. This is a reissue by the grandson of the original Joseph Schirò. Joseph Schirò was a hydrographer. He was the hydrographer to the king, quite a prestigious position. Must have been Louis XV. And although his son trained as an apprentice in his father's atelier, he wasn't all that interested, and he in fact oriented himself more and more toward painting, harbor scenes, but painting. And so it was the grandson, who confusingly is also called Antoine, but Antoine Fils, who basically reissued this without, I think, much updating of any kind, which is why there is no Tinier. Apart from that, it's, I think, a terribly charming book, redolent of the past. It has all the harbors along the north side of the Mediterranean, you know, starting in Gibraltar, taking you to the Dardanelles and coming back Alexandria to Tangiers. And on the Black Sea, you go from Odessa all the way around to, what is it? Well, it'll come to me. And you know, many of these ports have no commercial significance anymore. If they've been lucky, they've been able to recast themselves as ports for pleasure yachts. And so you leaf through this, and you know, there are all these names that are dimly familiar, but they are no longer commercial ports. But it's a lovely book. This is, if I may say, this is what you saw earlier on, and Joseph pointed out the red spots on the map, which I think can probably be dated somewhere around 1892, 3, 4, thereabouts. I say that partly because the breakwater was commissioned in 1900 and was completed in 1903. And this map was published by the Admiralty in 1888. So, you know, you have a fairly narrow window, and publication in the early 90s is probably correct. But I think apart from that, I find the map very attractive for topographical reasons. The topographical picture you see here is the 1850s, 1854, Captain Spratt, and I forget his name. And I think it is probably also connected with the works going on in Suez. You know, all of a sudden, the course which had been all the way around the Cape of Good Hope was now again projected to be through the Mediterranean. And so the whole Mediterranean got much more attention. You see the same thing on the harbors in France and in Spain. They all gear themselves to getting much more traffic than they had had for several hundred years. And so Malta is no exception of that. And you know, clearly we needed much more information, including the depth. And you know, all these numbers are depth in fathoms. And this was done in 1868 to 1872, 73, thereabouts. And so this map was published in 1888. I think, a lovely piece, I must say. Then this little map here is a very much more modest map, obviously, published by a man called Wilkinson. And he is of interest to us because he knew Captain Gollcher. There are elements of correspondence, not a lot, but a bit, in our archives. He wrote to Captain Gollcher. And he was clearly somebody who was interested in Malta, because this is not the only little booklet he had. He has another booklet about the Auberge de Provence and, another one. And if you look at the information he has, he's clearly somebody who spent a lot of time here. And not just in Valletta, but also out. There are 7 or 8 maps in this, including a very, very attractive and detailed map of the Tarshin temples. So not Hajarim, but Tarshin, which I found interesting. Wilkinson was a colonel in the British Army. We do not know whether he was here during the war or after the war. As Joseph said, this was published in the early 1950s. And so we don't know whether he may have made the acquaintance of Captain Gollcher during the period of the war or subsequently, but they knew each other. I found it interesting to flip through it and to know that at that time one could get bed and breakfast at the Osborne for 13 shillings. So I think that nowadays in one of the, the modern hotels you pay a bit more than that. And then the last map that I wanted to highlight, it's a bit of a tight fit, I'm afraid. It's also a map which Joseph showed, Anton Francesco Cirni. As he mentioned, Cirni was a chaplain in the order and came originally from Corsica. And when the call came out to come to the aid of the order, he made his way down to Corsica, but literally speaking, he missed the last boat. And so he was stuck on Sicily, waiting, and then joined the Gran Soccorso as soon as he could. So, as Joseph said, this is one of the 2 sources of what happened during the Great Siege. One by Balbidico Reggio, who actually was here fighting, and the other by Anton Francesco Cirni, who basically talked to all the survivors as soon as he came here. So, in a sense, it's very first-hand, but not somebody who fought here first-hand. I was very struck by one thing, and that is that there are little markings on the map that indicate the Turks and the Christians, not the Maltese, or the Knights of Malta, or the people who came with the Gran Soccorso, but Christians. And I thought that was sort of an interesting reflection of the way in which people thought at the time. I don't know about you, but when I arrived and my wife and I came to live here in 2004, I was initially very puzzled by the image of Malta in cartography. I think of Malta as being northwest, southeast, sort of like this. Whereas all the early maps show nothing like this. The earliest maps, and I'm talking printed maps, I'm not talking Idrisi, show it as almost as a round. You could almost say like a crab with 2 arms, and then there is the headland sort of sticking out. And then you have later maps from the Lafreri school, sort of 1550s, 1560s, and some of them are vertical. And then there are others like this one that are in the form of a fish swimming to the left or a fish swimming to the right. This one swims to the left, and southwest is at the top. And judging by what Joseph showed, I think the first map he showed of the position northwest, southeast was Bridone's. Now, there may well have been earlier maps, but I found it interesting to see that the first one he showed is as late as late 1700s. So, a cartographic history with a changing form of Malta. And I found that interesting. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.